pony home to Agnes. In the afternoon, Mrs. Ewan would send the pony back to the village in time for the bus. The pony grazed in the green until Jimmy arrived. He then rode it home. Craigroy Farm. Mr. and Mrs. John Young stayed here. Their daughter married Bill Ettles of the Culliver Hill at Forres. Mr. Young was a brother of William Young of Dombreg. Then there was Captain Watson, who stayed and farmed at the Ardagh. There was a family of Faulkners here as horsemen. Then Mr. Glasgow, who stayed at Agnes. His tractorman was Gordon Bremner and family. Then Mr. and Mrs. Tom McKellar and family, Barbara and Hamish. They still farm here today. The Lennox Hill. I am now heading up over the Lennox Hill towards Dallas Forest Road. We are now at the prisoner of war camp. This camp was built to house Italian and German prisoners of war. They were transported to farms around Marishare to work. British soldiers looked after them. Sergeant Walker later married Ella Watt of the village. Sergeant Tommy Livingston later married Agnes MacArthur of the village. And Mary Mackenzie later married Heinz Jobs, a German prisoner. He was called Darky for short. Mary and Darky made their home in Dallas for some time. The Lennox, the keeper's house for this area. Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Harvey and son George and daughter Isa. George later married Ella McCubbin of the village. Hugh was a keen bowler and cycled to the hall twice a week. He would leave the hall around 10:30 p.m. and cycle back to the Lennox. Then there was the Reeds, stayed here. Mr. and Mrs. Archie Stewart and family are the only ones I remember staying here. Runnygoop Farm. Frank Ross farmed the land. I can remember a Helen Grassick came to school from here. Then Mr. and Mrs. Bob Juni and family, who flitted from Runnivay. Then they went to the Mains of Edinvale. Blackmire. Mr. Noble, better known as Black Dan, stayed here. Then Alec McGilvery of Bellathragan. He still lives here today. Coldwells. At the top of the green field you will see a heap of stones. That was the croft of Coldwells. Mr. and Mrs. John Young flitted here from Craigroy. He bought the white mule at Tom Corkroup. They brought up two children, Billy and Elizabeth Urquhart. Then Mr. and Mrs. MacDonald Wilson and family. They later moved to Scotaclies. Then Mr. and Mrs. Rugg. Then Mr. and Mrs. James Mackay retired to here from being keeper on Craigmill Estate. From Slack End, Road End, where Mr. and Mrs. William Bowie and daughter Jean and Lizzie Marshall stayed. Jean had two sons, one was called John. Looking straight ahead, you see the rooftops of Coldholm Farm, then on to Branch Hill Farm beside the trees, and then right over the water to the Suitors of Cromarty. A great view on a good day. Mr. and Mrs. John Ross and family, Mary, Cathy, Alice, Jean, Bert and Jimmy. There was a feedloon, first Louis Cantley, then Robert Fraser. Jimmy and Bert farmed the land. Mary and Cathy were in the house. Cathy married Louis Stewart of Scotaclies. Jimmy married Jeannie Sutherland of the village. They had a son Ian, who married Joan Ross of Rafford. They had two sons, Morris who now farms their castle, and Douglas, a mason. I drove home their first tractor, a green Fordson from Elgin Central Engineers on iron wheels. I started school here in 1930. Infant teacher was Miss Flora MacDonald, who lodged at Bow Mills. The intermediate teacher was Miss Napier. She lodged with Mrs. Templeton in the village. The headmaster, Mr. J. Stark, who was a green beekeeper and bowler. He also taught the country dancing in the hall. The next master was Mr. Lindsay. Other teachers were Miss Grant, Dr. Fail, Miss Wilson, Miss Rhinus, Miss Haddon, Miss Rennie Campbell, and Miss Margaret. Miss Flora MacDonald, who stays in Elgin at the Grove Nursing. I'll speak now. From the East End. Mr. and Mrs. Donald McInnes, who farmed the Hoon, stayed here. Then the Alpine family, Jock, Donny, Annie. Then Mr. and Mrs. George Finney and son Jimmy. Jimmy still stays here. Number 2, oldest son Johnny, who was horseman at Hatton, stayed here. Mr. McAlpin and family, Jock and Annie. Then Mr. and Mrs. Cant and daughter Jean and son John. Jean later married the bar of the post office. Mr. and Mrs. James, the roadman, and family, Peter, Isaac, Helen and Jean. Then Mr. and Mrs. Bob Cuthbert, who was the next roadman, and family, Agnes, Molly and Hilda. Where these next 2 houses was a field. Number 4, Mr. and Mrs. Lockie Fraser and daughter Margaret and son Ronald stay here. Peg still stays here today. Number 5, Mrs. Grant Stewart and daughters Una and Margaret. Margaret and her husband Whitey stay here today. We used to stand in this built-up fireplace and get the heat through the wall from Jock McRae's fire. Mr. and Mrs. Jock McRae in this end. He was called Black Jock. In the other end, Mr. and Mrs. Rose and family. I can remember 2 of the sons, Alec and Harry. Number 8, Leslie Cottage. Mr. and Mrs. Dodd McIntosh and daughter Dorothy stayed here. It was a single-storey house then. The Holdsworth Institute. Hall keepers, Mr. and Mrs. William Mackenzie and family, Chrissy, Sonny, Eva and Molly. He had a joinery business in the village. Then Mr. and Mrs. Alec Thompson and daughter Sheila. Alec was a joiner at Dallas Estates. Then Mr. and Mrs. Bob Mackenzie and daughter Ruby and son George. Then Mr. and Mrs. John Stewart. The shop. Mr. and Mrs. Alec Campbell was grocer and baker. The old building was burned down in the 1930s. Watt Hepburn bought it and had managers in it. Bert Bay, who married Annie Sutherland. Then there was Charlie Jimison. Jack Christie was the last manager. Mr. and Mrs. Christie later built a small shop beside the bungalow. Charlie Nichol was also a manager. Dan and Ethel Hay took over the shop, and they were the last tenants.